Today I'm gonna talk about why, in my view, RPGs should not be viewed as simulators. And what do I mean by this? Well, this ties into an assumption about how RPGs, or rather what RPGs should be like when you're playing them. And this assumption is that when you're playing the game, you're gonna tell a story. And this might again seem very obvious, like of course the game is like, it's a story that unfolds about the characters and what they do, right? Well, in my view, this assumption creates a lot of problems, especially for beginner DMs, and indeed this was an assumption I made when I started DMing. So let's take a look at the word simulation. Like, a simulation is something that is like something else, right? Like, for example, if you play a simulator game, like a flight simulator, it's supposed to be like flying an airplane. So people assume that when you play a fantasy RPG, what the game should be like is it should be like a fantasy story. And let's examine this. What is a fantasy story like? Well, fantasy stories, they're often like very epic stories. That is, they're long. They often span a great deal of events, and they often involve heroic characters that succeed against great odds. So if you assume your D&D game is gonna be like that, what you end up with is a thing that spans a lot of events, and where the characters go against great odds and they succeed. Now, in this sentence, there's an assumption of success there. And you might disagree with me, but let me evaluate on this. Like, why do I feel like the success of the characters is assumed? Well, when you have a story, like a fantasy novel or any novel really, and a story has a beginning and a story also has an end. And because if the characters in a story, they always like reach some type of end state in the story. And basically stories like these heroic stories that a lot of people try to emulate in their RPGs, they're heroic stories that have a happy ending, where the heroes in the end they succeed. That is very common. Of course, not all fantasy stories end with like the heroes winning, but that's another story. Because, like, what if in Star Wars, what if Luke, when he rides the speeder bike on Endor, what if he just ran into a fucking tree and he just died and credits roll? That wouldn't be very satisfying, right? Like, I feel like the people who watch that movie would be like, well, that wasn't a very nice story. Like, I wanted Luke to succeed. And, or rather, you wanted the story to have like a meaningful ending rather than the randomness of cruel death, where Luke just fails and he dies. So stories often, they have like an ending where the heroes succeed. And when you assume that the game is like a story, there is an assumption there that the heroes are gonna succeed in the end. Like, you can't, if your character, let's say Luke is the character in an RPG, then there should be a chance of him just running into that tree, right? So, but for a lot of people, I don't believe they think that way. I think they assume, they have like an assumption in the back of their head that when the game is the telling of a story and the heroes can't really fail, you need to reach the end of the story. And when the game is like that, I believe there can't be a real risk of failure. There can be only an illusion of the risk of failure. A lot of DMs, do this, I feel. Like, I've experienced this, I'm gonna get into that later, and I've seen a lot of people who make YouTube videos about DMing. They say that, like, well, the DM can cheat. The DM can lie to the players about what the outcomes of the die rolls are, and he can change the outcome of that die roll just arbitrarily in order to keep the characters alive, in order for the story to be finished. And there's no real risk there. There are no real stakes because your characters are always gonna make it. And running the game like that, where there's just an illusion of the chance of failure, or the risk of failure rather, it might work, but that illusion might break. And when that happens, that's a bad scene. And I'm now going to tell a story about a time when the illusion broke for me. So me and my buddies, we were playing a post-apocalyptic role-playing game called Mutant Undergångens Arvtagare, which is a Swedish RPG. And in the course of this campaign, we were captured by an air pirate. Like, he was basically a pirate who flew around in the post-apocalyptic world in a giant, like, zeppelin, and menacing the people of the world. It was very cool. Like, this campaign, it was a very fun campaign. I had a lot of good times in it. And the DM, I feel he did a great job because it was fun most of the time. But at one point during the game, the illusion broke and it was ruined for me. Because he used this core assumption of a story that has a prepared ending, like it has a prepared course. Like, the heroes are supposed to do this, and then they're supposed to do this, and they can't really fail, because then it would be like when Luke just runs into the tree, a very unsatisfying ending. It needs to reach the ending I have thought out. So yeah, we're captured on this airship, right? And this was a long time ago, but we, if I remember correctly, we did something where we attacked the henchmen of this air pirate. I think we tried to break out of the room we were imprisoned in. And we didn't succeed, and the pirate captain, the villain, he just came into us, and he was just like, "Oh, you guys, don't do that again. I might be really mad. You don't do that." And then I felt like, okay, so we just tried to, we basically just killed a few of his guys and, like, injured a few of his other guys. But he didn't punish us. He just, like, wagged his finger at us and said, "Oh, don't do that." So then I felt like, okay, is there really a chance for us to fuck up now? Like, is there even a possibility at this stage of us fucking up? And here's when I kind of started to be a dick towards the DM and towards the other players, because I basically tried to see how far we could go, or how far I could go, and if the pirate captain would punish us. So what I did, I was kind of getting mad at this point, or at least, like, agitated over this insight that, like, the GM, he's just holding our hands, and he's making sure we don't die now. Like, I was getting kind of agitated, but I think I got agitated because I felt betrayed, that, like, the things we could do, they held no meaning because there was no stakes. Like, we could not exercise agency and do anything that could make us die in this situation. Like, nothing we could do was meaningful because we were guaranteed not dying. So what my character, or what I decided to do at that point, it was like, okay, this ends now. I'm crashing this airship with no survivors. So that was what we started doing. I just, like, I broke out of the cell, and I ran through the airship, and I thought, like, okay, I'm crashing this airship. So I went towards, like, an engine room, and I stuck a stick of dynamite, if I recall correctly, into some cogs of the engine. The engine blows up, and I also succeed in blowing a hole in like the Zeppelin body of the airship. So what happens was the Zeppelin tilts on its side in the air because one half of it, the gas that keeps it afloat, leaked out. So what then happened was the corridor I had arrived into the engine room from was now flipped on its side and became like an elevator shaft, or just like a vertical shaft. And me and the other characters, we had to basically escape while we felt that the airship was crashing. It was a very cool moment where my character, who by the way was a robot with inbuilt grappling hook launchers in his wrists, he could the fact that I had that ability, it made sure we could escape, because I lifted out all the guys in the party through this vertical shaft that once was a corridor, and we managed to escape to ground which was level, so we could run away from the vertical shaft. And this was super cool. I felt like we're actually having an impact on the story right now. I was having fun, but what then happened was that we got cornered by the pirates, and eventually we feel that the airship straightens up again. So the floor of the airship is once again parallel to the ground, and the pirate captain comes and he's just like, "You guys, you almost crashed my airship, but we repaired it. We managed to save it. Don't do that again. I might be really mad at you." And he threw us in the cell again. And at that point, it was ruined for me, because my moment where I decided to exercise my agency to make what was basically like a suicidal action, where my robot was just through with this, and I wanted to crash the airship, killing possibly myself and all the pirates and all my friends, just because like I can't allow this to continue. And I'm rationalizing it a little bit now, because it was mainly me as a player, me as a person, being kind of a dick and trying to sabotage the game. But I tried to sabotage it. I couldn't stop myself, because I wanted to test this hypothesis of mine that we could not in fact fail. And as it turned out, we couldn't fail in this situation. Like we didn't even get punished. The pirate captain just came up and wagged his finger at us again. And I understand why the DM did this, because we weren't supposed to die at that point. We were supposed to continue playing the story and continue having fun indeed. And that's why I said I was kind of being a dick, because I was trying to sabotage what the DM had. He had like worked hard to prepare this story. And this is nothing against the DM I had at that time. Like I said, it was a fun campaign up to this point. He in my view, he did a good job. But he had this core assumption that the game is the telling of a story, and the story has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and you need to reach the end that I have prepared. So again, this worked as an illusion for a while, but then it dawned on me that there were no real stakes in the game. And unfortunately, from my experience, a lot of DMs rather, they use this method where they basically lie to their players, and they deprive them of the chance of having any real meaningful agency with their characters. And that doesn't feel right to me. So instead of this, what should you do? Well, think about it like this. The story you want to simulate. Like, say, you want a game that's sort of like Star Wars, you want a game that's sort of like The Lord of the Rings. Those two stories are stories about people who did succeed against the odds. And your characters in a role-playing game, they might become those people. they might become the people, the heroic characters who does succeed against the odds. But that success should not be taken for granted, because when you have something that's taken for granted, it has no value. Like, if you get a thing for free, you're not going to appreciate that thing as much as something you worked hard for, at least in my opinion, that's the case. So what should you do as the DM? Because on some level, you want the game to be a story. Like, you want it to be like a story about your characters. You should view the game not as a story simulator. You should view the game as a story generator. You should prepare in ahead of time. You should not prepare a story. You should prepare ingredients for a story that might happen organically through play, during play. That is, you should make your NPCs, your non-player characters, and your environments and all that stuff, and just throw the characters into it and see what happens, and let a story organically develop. So, in short, you should provide the ingredients for the story, but you should not, like, bake the cake, as it were, in advance, because the baking of the cake, the generation of the story, where basically anything can happen, that, in my view, is the better way to play RPGs. So, in conclusion, RPGs should not be a story simulator, they should be a story generator.